Welcome, Year 11 Ancient students, and welcome to the Screencast on Introduction to Ancient Egypt.
Yes, welcome. And we thought we'd share with you one of our happy memories from the aquarium. What a great day that was.
Don't I just love your slightly racist Chinese hat and your glasses with the tag still on? It's a beautiful picture.
Was there a construction site outside? Or?
Yeah, I've got a second job in construction.
Oh, really?
See Tonka Company.
Tickle me.
Oh, Elmo loved that day. Okay, now moving on. Now the physical geography of ancient Egypt was really incredibly important in the development of the entire civilization.
That's right. Very much like every other ancient civilization around this time, they were around about a major river network such as the Yellow River in China, the Indus Valley in India and Pakistan, and also the Euphrates and the Tigris in ancient Sumer.
So many civilizations, known as the river civilizations, developed around these particular rivers. Now the Nile was this major source of life in what was essentially an otherwise arid desert.
That's right, and Egypt actually became known for two different types of lands. They were distinct lands that were very different from one another. The very rich, fertile, black alluvial soils were known as Kemert,
or otherwise known as the Black Lands, and literally called the Black Lands because of the black silt deposits that would be spread across the land when the Nile flooded each year.
And that's why I took Kemert with me to the aquarium. Why are there so many songs about rainbows?
Okay, we need to do this in 15 minutes.
Okay.
So let's move on. Okay.
Sorry.
Now the Redlands, on the other hand.
Sorry.
This is the... he's sorry.
Sorry.
Now this is the desert areas off to the east and west of the alluvial Nile floodplains.
Now, whilst these areas didn't offer anything in terms of agriculture, they were rich in other resources such as minerals, particularly gold, and they also served as a protective barrier from outside invaders, such that the civilization was able to establish itself and flourish early on.
Now, as you can see from this satellite imagery, and this is obviously modern satellite imagery, you can see that the Nile Delta towards the northeast of Egypt is where the civilization really clusters around and then spreads out towards the south, but only along the banks of the Nile. So you could call this a really centralized civilization even today.
That's right, and the ancients really had this major life-giving source, which was the Nile, and together with the sun, it provided for all of their agriculture, which enabled them to increase their population and build a civilization as such.
And not only was Egypt geographically divided into the Red and the Black Lands, it was also politically divided into Upper and Lower Egypt. And these were two really distinct political regions, particularly during the pre-dynastic period.
Upper Egypt, you could consider to be upstream. It's higher in terms of sea level, and it's basically the Nile, the very narrow strip of fertile lands around it that is flooded on a yearly basis.
Now, Lower Egypt, on the other hand, is the really super fertile Nile Delta that spreads out, feeds out into the ocean. Now, you can see from this map here just how green these plains would be for ancient Egypt, so it really became a hub for the entire civilization.
There were hundreds of different tributaries that were leading all the way out into the Mediterranean Sea, and by a system of irrigation, bringing water to the crops, it enabled there to be plentiful and a surplus every year.
Now, the most important thing with the Nile was the annual inundation, or the annual floods that would take place. Now, these massive floods would deposit these alluvial silts all over the banks of the Nile. Now, you can see from this picture here that blue line is the original Nile River, and then where the red ends up is the peak of the flood. So you can see just how large these floods would be.
Think of last year's floods, and particularly how much topsoil was redistributed from areas like Grantham and Gatton and around those, all the way down, the stream around Brisbane and out into Moreton Bay.
But unfortunately, in Brisbane, it wasn't farming land that was flooded, it was people's houses. But you can see how the ancient Egyptians would have utilised this super fertile flood.
Ouch.
Okay, moving on. Now, so you can't underestimate the importance of the Nile to the ancient Egyptian civilization, particularly through what you can see here, which are irrigation channels.
Now, they were very advanced in terms of irrigation. They also brought in a plough as well, and these things enabled their fertility to increase.
And so you can see why they kind of, worshipped this annual inundation, this flood of the Nile. They even had a personification, a goddess known as Hapi.
They revered Hapi, and you can see her there. I would like to say that, to me, she's a modern-day Smurfette. I mean, an ancient Smurfette.
What about Avatar?
Yeah, you could say that, but
Yeah.
I don't
Her
know.
hair isn't covering her nipples, though.
Yeah, true. Actually, that's a little bit X-rated. Can we have that on there?
Oh, we might have to edit it out.
Check with SLT.
We will. So without the life-giving floods, Egypt, would not have been able to flourish, and these life-giving floods were sent by this goddess Hapi.
And if they didn't arrive on a yearly basis, then that could actually, spell a lot of trouble for the civilization.
Now, Egypt is it's thousands of years of history, so historians have split it up into easily manageable phases.
Firstly, you have pre-dynastic Egypt. This is prior to Egypt actually being, centralized. The Upper and Lower Egypt being united, and there's a series of small chieftains, rival clans that were probably in a permanent kind of state of warfare or rivalry of some kind.
Then you've got the early dynastic period, which is common glossed over because it's overshadowed by the more important Old Kingdom. Now, the Old Kingdom is where you have things like the Great Pyramids of Giza being built. So this is what's really depicted in a great deal of, what everybody knows about ancient Egypt.
Middle Kingdom was more epitomized by monumental temples being built, particularly worshipping the sun god Amun and Amun-Ra. And the powerful priesthoods, really did dominate during this period.
And then the New Kingdom is really characterised by some of the more famous pharaohs like Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, and the warrior pharaohs such as Thutmose and Ahmose and Kamose. So now the development of Egypt throughout these distinct phases, they had these the small periods in between known as the intermediate periods.
These intermediate periods are basically where civilization collapses or civilization is turned upside down.
Not so much collapses, just changes in a really massive way.
There's not a lot of evidence, particularly concerning the first intermediate period, but what we do know is perhaps there was a series of very low floods that led to famine and drought, and you can see by these pictures here that the people are absolutely starved and famished. That relief or that frieze is depicting people that during the first intermediate period, when times were obviously very tough.
So just think of what would have happened in ancient times if we'd been hit by something like the droughts that we had for upwards of 12 years. We could manage it because we're
because we've got Anna Bligh, people.
Yes,
that's why
she managed everything. So these floods, these droughts rather, were really highly detrimental to the civilization.
Okay, now another characteristic of time concerning historians is the dynasties. Now, these dynasties are basically when very powerful families are able to maintain power within that bloodline for a length of time.
So within pretty much every ancient civilization that we'll study throughout history, there are these powerful family dynasties. And you can see, just look at the 18th dynasty in that diagram and look at all of the Ramesses that follow each other in that dynasty. So every single one of those was born of the same family.
Very much like today, where you have the Bush regime and the Kennedys and now the Clintons, where power is maintained in these families that have connections,
particularly wealthy families,
and wealth.
So this has just been a brief introduction to the overall concept of ancient Egypt as a civilization.
Look forward to it, people. It's a fascinating civilization which is full of intrigue. It's an allegory wrapped within a mystery, and you're going to love the roller coaster.
So we'll see you all in class. Thanks, guys.